Welcome to the Japan Zoominar at UC San Diego. And today is actually March 23rd, 2021. I'm Ulrike Schaede. I'm a professor of Japanese business at UC San Diego. I'm also the director of JFIT, the Japan Forum for Innovation and Technology. We are at GPS, the School of Global Policy and Strategy. We are an international relations and public policy school with a focus on the Pacific. We offer various degree programs, including a Master of International Affairs with a Japan specialization. If you're interested in our degree offerings, please go to gps.ucsd.edu. At GPS, we have JFIT, our Japan Center. More information on JFIT you can find at jfit.ucsd.edu. That is also our website where we have a sign-up list for our newsflash, as well as a tab that can guide you to past recorded Zoominars and, of course, future sign-ups to future Zoominars. This is a weekly event. We meet every Tuesday at 4:30 p.m. California time, which is 8:30 in Tokyo on Wednesdays. Today, of course, we have Louise Young here, and I'll introduce her shortly, but allow me to briefly give you a preview of upcoming events. Next week, we'll have Professor Chung from the University of Tokyo School of Medicine, and he's also the Dean of the Kanagawa School of Health Innovation, to talk about how Japan is handling the pandemic from a public health perspective. Following that is Robert Madsen with a session on Japan's power and influence in the emerging world order. And then we'll have the redo of Patty McLachlan, who was here before, but was cut short due to the Texas the power outages with the storm. So she'll be back to talk about Japan's policies for the common people. And then further on in April, we'll have my former colleague and dear friend Takeo Hoshi come and talk about his new books on Abenomics and the Japanese economy. Our March events are supported in part by the Japan Society for the Promotion of Science in San Francisco. And next week, after the meeting with Professor Chung, they will hold an information session regarding their fellowship programs, both for faculty and also PhD students. So if you are interested in being supported by the JSPS and or have PhD students that might benefit from their support, please join us at 5:30 next week for an info. Our Zoominars are recorded, and as I mentioned before, you can find past events at jfit.ucsd.edu/Zoominar. Because they're recorded, when you will ask questions later on, and you can do so through the Q&A button, I will refer to you only by your first name to ensure your privacy. All right, and with that, I have Louise here. So let me stop my PowerPoints and introduce our speaker. There she is, Professor Young, welcome. So let me talk a little bit about who you are. A lot of people who are here probably know you already, but still, I would be amiss. So you're a professor of history at the University of Wisconsin Medicine. You have a BA from the University of Wisconsin Medicine. Where are you actually from? Your PhD is MA and PhD in political science / history are from Columbia University. You are a social and cultural historian, which I find a very interesting label, of modern Japan, which is different from contemporary, of course, modern Japan, with a focus on World War II in Asia, imperialism, and urban history. Your two main books are your absolutely fabulous book that we're going to talk about today, Japan's Total Empire from 1998. And the second fabulous one is Beyond the Metropolis, Second Cities and Modern Life in Interwar Japan. You've been a visitor to Todai, Kyodai, Waseda, and most recently you were a distinguished achievement professor at Princeton in 2019 when we last saw each other. So welcome, Louise. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much.
So you want to just start, or should I just let me tell people why I invited you. Okay. So January 6th is going to be in our history books, and it was the day when the democracy of the United States of America was attacked. that day also gave us a moment to think about how does that not only line up, but how was that experience way back when in other countries that had a similar event happening to them. And a lot of articles I've seen in the New York Times were talking about Germany and then the experience of Germany. What I have not seen at all, in fact, is what was the experience in Japan. And so what we want to do today, Louise, is kind of try to figure out, go back in history and look at Japan in the interwar period and how our experience of January 6th makes us reflect on what it must have been like then and how to position all of that. So with that, why don't you start out with a few thoughts on those things, and then we'll get into the Q&A.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. It's really a pleasure to be here with you. So let me just start out by asking this question, why should January 6th prompt us to rethink the problem of Japanese fascism? And I think that, we tend to look at the rise of fascism as this kind of millennial event, a sort of a once-off horror show. And I feel like often we look back with an almost voyeuristic fascination at Hitler and Tojo and Mussolini as these kind of monsters of the 20th century. And that of the atrocities like the Holocaust or the Nanjing Massacre as these singular expressions of kind of evil incarnate. But I guess one of the questions that comes in, what if this is not true? What if what happened in Japan in the 1930s is not something alien to us, but is something that could happen here? And I think this opens up the possibility for really looking at 1930s Japan with fresh eyes, at a place that isn't strange and exotic, but actually familiar and intimate. So to kind of set the table for those of you who aren't really familiar with the political history of pre-war Japan, in 1932, Japan was a constitutional monarchy with a democratically elected National Assembly. In the 1920s, most observers would describe what around them a vibrant democracy, power sort of traded back and forth between two centrist parties and a handful of smaller parties on the left and right. In 1925, the Diet, the National Assembly, passed universal manhood suffrage, which symbolized this, enormous milestone, a kind of triumphant moment for the march of democracy. Because when the Constitution had been promulgated in 1889, 1% of the population could vote. They were eligible because of the property qualifications. But by 1925, things had really progressed. And so this appeared to sort of presage an arc of history that was going to continue to bend toward democratic progress. But this democratic system underwent an extended stress test between 1929 and 1932. And the stress test, was brought about by sort of twin crises in the economy and in Japan's empire. So in the economy, we had some problems that had been brewing for a number of years in the 1920s, with particular problems in the financial sector. There was a big bank run in 1927, which put hundreds of small and medium banks out of business. And there was also this massive consolidation where the big banks that belonged to the Zaibatsu consolidated and sort of like Pac-Man. They ate up all these smaller and medium shaky banks. And this still kind of shaky financial situation was hit by the international crisis. October 29, the stock market crash, and this reverberates around the world. And it's at this moment, right after the American stock market crash, that the Japanese government decides we're going to go back on the gold standard. So January 1930, they go back on the gold standard, and this was a total disaster. The yen, appreciates, goes skyrocketing exports plunge by like 50%. Gold floods out of the country. And the side-off effects of this are really devastating. Unemployment ranges between 29, 30, 31, between 15 and 20%. The small and medium commercial and manufacturing sector is absolutely devastated. And the rural sector is completely gutted by deflation. Agricultural prices fall some 40% during this period. And once again, it's felt unevenly. The results of this are uneven. So small and medium landowners, they are the ones that really cannot survive this. And in desperation, they kick their tenant farmers off the land. So the countryside is just in this world of hurt. So that's one thing. Simultaneously, you have in the empire another crisis brewing. In the heart of Japan's empire in Northeast Asia, in China. And so Japan's position in China is based on unequal treaties and kind of legal imperialism. And they have used this legal imperialism to build up extensive mining and railroad and manufacturing interests in China. And most of these, there's some in Shandong, some in Shanghai, but most of it is in Manchuria, in the northeast region of China. But in the 1920s, the Chinese nationalist movement's getting going, and they begin something called rights recovery, which is to push back and try to claw back these rights and interests that had been signed away, the leaseholds, through gunboat diplomacy and as part of the unequal treaties. And so the Chinese nationalists are launching boycotts against Japan, lawsuits, strikes, and so on. And this is really gumming up the works and the growth of Japanese economic enterprise in China. And so by the late 1920s, the profits from enterprise in China are just dropping like a stone. And this is creating a huge panic among all of those different Japanese actors in China who are sending, SOS back to Tokyo, where this is a state of emergency. And it's also covered in the newspapers and in the magazines. The situation is breaking down, and something has to be done to protect this position in Manchuria. And so in the face of these twin crises, the economic crisis and then the empire crisis, the faith in government capacity to fix any of this just is disintegrating. It's disintegrating by the month. It's disintegrating by the week. The government just appears ineffective, frozen. People blame the government for mistakes like the gold standard, but also the failure to act, not sort of pushing back more aggressively against the rights recovery movement. But also they are very disappointed in sort of the political parties and their allies as being sort of narrowly focused on their own self-interest and not on the larger crisis of the state and the nation. And so, this is a legitimacy crisis at the top, and it provides this opening for anti-democratic actors to sort of jump in, which they do. So right-wing organizations, and particularly those within the army, take this opportunity in the early 1930s to stage a series of attempted coups between 1931 and 36, which are increasingly ambitious, increasingly violent. This is culminates in the February 26th incident in 1936, which nearly succeeded, but was eventually put down. So just one last point before I open it up for discussion. So that happens in 1936. And there's this, when we think about kind of the arc of what you could call creeping fascism across the 1930s. A wonderful political scientist named Maruyama Masao, who wrote in really very insightful ways about the problems of Japanese fascism. He described this creeping fascism as a process, and he said the period between 31 and 36 he called fascism from below, because this was when these outsider groups, or even violent domestic terrorists, were trying to stage these coups. But then once those had failed finally in February 36, then we shift to fascism from above. And here, this is the beginning of the efforts by reform officers, by bureaucrats, who carry out essentially the fascization of the state from above or from within, through a series of reforms that continually expand state power over the economy, over politics, over society, in order to create the national defense state that's capable of fighting a total war.
Great, thank you. So that's a great background, and so now we got the story. So now let's fill this in a little bit. Can we start with the Taisho democracy? So the Taisho democracy, with my limited understanding of it, were like Japan's Roaring 20s, and I have these images of great discussions all around, sort of an awakening. There's the coffee shops, Hibiya Park, demonstrations, sort of Japan has arrived as an intellectual place with intellectual debate and discourse. Is that a fair understanding of the Taisho years, which were, what was that? They're actually in the 1910s, right? And early 1920s.
Yeah, so that's an interesting question. So Taisho, that's the imperial reign name, and Taisho actually was from 1912 to 1926. But when people use the phrase Taisho democracy, they're really kind of referring to the period between World War I up through the early 1930s, and it really, in some ways, it when you say Taisho democracy, that is the period when we had party governments, party cabinets. So 1918 to 1932 is kind of like that period in a way. But so if we think of it as roughly equivalent to the Roaring 20s of America, or the Weimar Republic in Germany, yes, it was very much this time, and especially in the sort of through the eyes of people that lived at that moment, it was this moment of tremendous possibility, the flowering of this opportunity for progressivism and democracy, and a real vaulting optimism for a new world. People were in, the sort of ideas that were this for just very rich synergy between different kinds of ideas, where people were really inspired by the Russian Revolution. And so there was all kinds of new scholarship and essays and imagination of different kinds of revolutionary possibilities that was in scholarship, but also in the arts. There was this very vibrant proletarian arts movement. So there was, but at the same time, that was, so the Russian Revolution was really popular, but so was Woodrow Wilson, and Wilsonian internationalism was hugely popular. And that also stimulated all kinds of new ideas about how Japan could be part of this liberal world order, that there was going to be a new kind of way of, getting beyond imperialism. Japan could be part of that. There was a whole new ideas about a little Japan that didn't have a huge empire. Japan could be a different kind of force in international relations. So there was, this very vibrant intellectual experimentation, Esperanto boom.
So then what happened? I mean, was there already something bad kind of simmering underneath, or was there a shock event, or how did this whole thing then fall apart?
So it's, at the time, you don't hear many people sort of, because voices of Cassandra, saying, oh, it's all going to go wrong. But after afterwards, there's a lot of historians that go back and they look and they say, oh, Taisho democracy was, not all that it was trumped up to be, that it had this very inflated sort of sense of promise. And in fact, there were a lot of weaknesses. And so, for example, one of the weaknesses of Taisho democracy was just the limits of the two-party system that had kind of evolved, and that parliamentary politics wasn't very easy to crack it open to all these newcomers that wanted to come in. Parliamentary politics was an insider's game. It was kind of democracy for the upper classes, and the parties and their allies, they had the system all sort of set up, and they weren't particularly interested in opening up and bringing women in, or bringing, Koreans in Japan in, or bringing poor people in, or bringing sort of labor unions in. So in fact, you had, the big political battle over women's suffrage in the 20s, and over universal manhood suffrage. One of the major parties, the Seiyukai, opposed it. They didn't want to have universal manhood suffrage. So, it's kind of a funny thing. You think, why would a political party oppose expanding the votes? But I guess, now we can see that in our own time as well. That with the Republican sort of attacks on voting as well. But so that was one kind of issue. And then I'll just, say one other thing, that this perception that the parties were very corrupt, and that they engaged in, they did sort of vote buying. They had, many of them had these little gangs of thugs that they sent around, and there was a lot of political violence associated with politicking and sort of keep running things. There was a lot of the elections were funded then in the same way they are now, with big business handing bags of money. So there were all of these sort of perceptions of some of the dirtiness and taintedness of political parties, which doesn't always come through in those optimistic prescriptions about the beautiful possibilities of Taisho democracy.
So why was society drawn to the extremes? I mean, was there a mechanism? I mean, so why was all of a sudden, both sides, right? Why was the communist way of thinking, where the military suddenly so attractive?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. And, when you look at in the 1920s, some of the kind of literature of the far left and of the far right, sometimes if you just, I sometimes will read something out loud to my students. I say, like, what do you think the political identity of this person is? And it's really hard to tell, because there's a place where both the far left and the far right are really outraged at the big business, at Zaibatsu. They both will say, there has to be land reform and a redistribution of land to solve the problem of all these poor tenants, and that it's wrong to have all the land owned by these, really big fat cat landowners. So there's just this sense of social injustice that I think fires up, both the far left and the far right. But the far right is also just highly motivated by, anti-communism. They really, anti-communism is become like a very, very powerful driving ideology in among the far right. And, Russophobia has, now become, red peril. And there's this sense that Russia is this big sort of geopolitical enemy, but also because it's busy sending in Comintern agents into Japan and trying to stir up and aid the Japanese Communist Party and the Japanese Socialist Party, that, you know, there's this fear that they're, you know, that they're coming inside the body politic and manipulating.
Is conspiracy part of that story? I mean, what? Because I guess there were also these conspiracy theories, right? That somehow Japan was in danger, or would lose out on its empire building, where it was late, I guess, compared to maybe the U.S. certainly, but also Germany. And so was there a conspiracy part of this, and what was the attraction of the right?
So, yeah, conspiracy, you know, I'm not sure how much there was a, you know, spread of the rumor mill of conspiracy theories, but conspiracy was absolutely part of the toolkit of the radical right. And you saw this especially in, you know, the early 1930s, both in the empire, but at home as well. And at this moment when you have this, you know, sort of, when it really is this inflection point, when the political turn is happening, and when fascism is really kind of taking root both within the government, but also capturing the imagination and the passions of the public. But so it's at this point that there's just a series of one conspiracy after another. First, the Manchurian incident, where the Japanese garrison army in Manchuria has just gotten so fed up with the situation there that they're, you know, they're like, Tokyo's not going to do anything about this. We can't get them to do anything. We're just going to take matters into our own hands. So they pretend that the local Chinese forces have blown up some Japanese railway track, and they say, okay, oh, we've just been attacked. And then they mobilize their force and they launch the invasion of Manchuria on this pretext that it's self-defense. And then the local Chinese forces decide that they're going to take a non-resistance policy. They're not going to fight back. Lay your arms down, which they do. And then so the Japanese Guangdong army just keeps manufacturing more and more pretexts for expanding the scope of operations. So it's just a whole series of sort of extended conspiracies there. And then in the meantime, in early 1932, there's action in Shanghai, the Shanghai incident. And here it's another conspiracy. And this one is because the Navy decides they're getting really resentful and jealous that the army is getting all the attention and also funding. All of a sudden, there's like, when they're doing the Manchurian invasion, the budgets go way up. And so the Navy's like, well, what about our budget? So they decide we have to have some sort of action. So they create a pretext and in Shanghai to say, oh, Japanese people are being attacked. We need to send in our forces, which they do. And it does succeed in getting some, you know, putting the Navy into the limelight. But all of these things, and then we have the creation of the puppet state of Manchukuo, which is another conspiracy. And then these are also, you know, there's a series of those coup attempts at home, which are in essence, you know, conspiracies to overthrow the government. So the right is very much, you know, their sort of toolkit is heavily dependent on this underground kind of nefarious actions, which you're bringing in these kind of underground actors and different people, and you're getting money from this source. You know, bags of money are going around. So I would say that in that sense, you know, it is very much part of the political story of the early 1930s.
So we're getting some great questions. So audience, if you'd like to have questions, we can't unfortunately have you kind of speak, but if you type it into Q&A, I will weave it into our conversation. And we have two on society. Robbie and Peter both have asked questions One is the economics of the situation. So was Japan an unequal society is his question. I actually just looked at the data, and it was actually more unequal at the time than the US was. Yeah. But so he wants to know whether splinter groups like these, whether these different sort of ways of thinking about things, and this group wants this and the other group wants that, and Peter reminds us that maybe it's a little bit too simplistic to say that the left was communist, because there were socialists as well, and other lefties, and then the right, of course, not everybody on the right was necessarily a fascist, but are we brushing over things here a little bit? And can you talk a little bit about what society was thinking at the time, or what the intellectuals were saying on all of this?
So yes, I didn't mean to sort of simplify what was a quite complex political field, both in the 1920s and in the 30s. I mean, the right-wing organizations were multifarious. They were very factionalized and fragmented. They tended to be sort of smaller and more sort of ideologically distinct than the parties, the opposition on the left, which ranged from the Japanese Communist Party to farmer labor parties to different incarnations of socialists and social democrats. And they were, these parties kind of reinvented themselves across the 20s and the 1930s. And of course, the Communist Party was forced underground very quickly after it formed in 1922. So its activities were, always constrained by that kind of political suppression. But so I guess you're asking me what the kind of social response was. Oh, there was the one question about the economy and the
unequal. How unequal was this? And so I mean, I just happened to look at the data the other day, and insofar as we have data on this sort of thing that are very reliable, if you compare the U.S. and Japan over the last 200 years in terms of the income earned by the top 1%, Japan was pretty unequal at the time, it seems.
Yes, I think that's true. And you can kind of look at that inequality in different sectors of the economy. So in the still in the 1920s, Japan is an overwhelmingly rural society. It is increasingly urbanized, but it's still a lot of the population and production is in rural areas. And the social structure in rural areas is such that a majority of people living there are tenant farmers. And there's this kind of hierarchy of different types of you have at the top landlords that own really big, huge tracts of land. So the very, very wealthy landlords, and they tend to be also invested in banks and local manufacturing, and they make a lot of money off of different kinds of things. But then underneath them, there's, landlords that just rent out a little bit of land, and under them, people that own land and work their own land. And then, you keep going down, and at the very bottom, you have these very, very impoverished tenant farmers that are renting a tiny piece of land here and a tiny piece of land there, and they can't even make enough money out of their land. So they also have to use some of their family labor to earn money on the labor market. And it's these people who in the early 1930s become the sort of face of rural distress, because they are selling their girls to brothels because they have nothing else to do. They are selling their boys to labor recruiters because, when you've sold everything else, all you have left is your children to sell. And so the kind of and many of the recruits, the conscripts in the military that are sent off to Manchuria, these are the families. These are their villages. These are their families. So the sort of plight of these people then gets very much linked up with patriotic support for our troops, and then this terrible situation. And whose fault is it? It's these evil landlords. It's these big, banks. It's the economic structure that that leaves so many people out in a really desperate situation.
So that seems to be a sort of an ingredient that would also apply to Germany in a similar way. It's a desperation for a solution of something, of some sorts, and the center not being really that attractive because the center has not been able to come up with a solution to something, I guess. So on that center question, so TJ, Tim, and a few others have asked about the political institutions, right? So you mentioned the parties, and so their question is, how strong was the Taisho democracy really, and the fact that it fell down so fast? Was it not a good democracy and therefore easy prey, so to say? Or what's your assessment of, and then also there's a question on what's the role of the emperor in all of this, but that's maybe a bigger bucket. So let's start maybe with the parties. And so what's and Harake, what was that all about? If you could give us a quick, so your assessment on how strong a democracy this really was, and did it have checks and balances like we would think of a democracy? The courts, were the parties weak?
So yeah, those are just really great questions, and I think so that the parties evolved on top of this constitution, the Meiji Constitution of 1889, which was a constitution that was, really set up for, it was kind of based on the German model. And it said, look, we want to have a very strong executive. And it created this cabinet, the relationship between the executive and the legislative branch that was called the Transcendental Cabinet System. So the cabinet was all set up to be completely cut off from and protected from the any kind of legislative control or democratically elected control. And this was the vision of the founders. They said, we don't want the riffraff telling us what to do. We want them just to be a rubber stamp. But it didn't go that way, because people like Harake and others who were organizing parties, they very, very cleverly over time used the one prerogative that the lower house had, which was to, pass or veto budgets, as a way of sort of extricating concessions and kind of working their way into the policymaking process. And so basically over, the first few decades of the operations of the Meiji Constitutional Order, there was this kind of process where the civil servants, the bureaucrats in the government, who had initially just thought, well, we're just going to run things on our own and just sort of get those guys to be a rubber stamp, and they realized that wasn't going to work. So they started trying to, they went in and they created their own bureaucratic parties. So they started getting their hands dirty, making their own parties, that then their idea was, this is going to be a party that supports the government efforts. And then at the same time, the political parties decided, well, what we need to do is we need to get our people inside the state. And so they started to trade for patronage positions in the Home Ministry or in the Ministry of, where the transportation is. And once they got those people in there, they could control some of the pork, and so they could then give these things to their constituents out in the local areas. So this process of parties and the deep state, if you will, sort of interpenetrating and doing this horse trading, that was how the whole kind of party system evolved, and to the point where Harake was kind of the big architect of this, as and he finally, he was very, very clever at doing this in the teens. And then he finally, in 1918, gets to name his own cabinet. And so he's the sort of first party cabinet. Well, he didn't last very long. He was shot by a right-wing ultranationalist in 1921. But that structure that he helped, he was one of the architects of, it does last, for more or less. Not every cabinet is a party cabinet, but many of them are. And but part of the thing is, this is a norm. It's not, it's based on, that everybody, all the stakeholders are agreeing that, yes, the head of the party, whoever wins most seats, they can decide on the prime minister. So what happens? Why does it end? Why does it end in 1932? Well, after this series of these increasing, there was first the March incident in 1931, where these angry young officers who are just enraged at the political parties, and they're enraged at the sort of corrupt government and all of these people who just don't understand what needs to be done, and they're not taking care of, they're not solving the problem, and they think we need to have a new government. We need to get rid of all of those people, all the dead wood, and install a new military government. So they make several attempts. In October, they try to do this. It fails. Then later in October, they try again. And then in May, try one more time. And in May, they do succeed in assassinating the prime minister. This was the biggest operation. And
which year was this now?
This is 1932. May.
So this is the end, right? But so is this like sort of the decisive moment where things turn bad, or is this like is there a watershed event where we can just put our finger on? If I wanted to know what happened, I can read about this one event, or is it more of a longer slippery slope sort of thing?
It's just a series of events, because that happens, and what happens then is that the series of right-wing terror essentially manages, they fail in their coups, but they succeed in terrifying everybody. All of a sudden, all the businessmen are walking around in vests and bulletproof vests. The civilians in the government are scared about what, speaking out, because somebody's going to shoot them. And so it creates this climate of terror. And it's at that moment that the people in the government say, we can't have any more party. We can't have the parties decide running the government anymore right now, because it's going to get these young officers way too agitated, and we don't want them, shooting off again. So let's stop with the party governments. And the parties themselves acquiesce to this, because they're filled with infighting factions, and in this kind of environment, the right-wing factions within both of the parties say, "Oh, this is our time," and so they basically, kind of agree with this, like, "Oh, we need to have the military in charge." So it's in that sense that the parties themselves, their sort of internal dynamics, their reliance on these sort of norms, and the corruption that is so built into their path to power makes them, acutely and uniquely vulnerable to this kind of, hostile takeover.
So it sounds as if it's really a process, Right? And so it wasn't a one-time event, but it was a series of events where initially people thought I wasn't so bad. Well, what happened to the guys that did these coup attempts in the late 20s? I mean, did they go to jail, or did they what were they what did Japan learn there or do there?
So that's another really interesting part of the story. So these guys that they were part of this organization called the Cherry Society, these young officers, and they had senior officers who were like very sympathetic towards them, who had been there, like their patrons within the military and so on. And they were arrested, but then the conditions of their arrest, they end up being placed in these really sort of cushy villas to be under house arrest in a villa, and they're basically having drinking parties under house arrest. And then they go to they have these trials where they're allowed all kinds of time to explain why they did what they did. And so it just becomes a platform for publicizing all of the discontents and the viewpoints of these young officers, these radical young officers. And they're hugely popular. Like people, will mail, there's like this deluge of fan mail essentially that comes to the court, like including like cut off fingers and stuff, where, that they're like, everybody's so moved by the patriotism of these young and the sincerity of these young officers. And indeed their senior officers, like this senior officer who's in the cabinet for much of the early 30s, Araki Sadao, he says, he's practically weeping and, talking about like the sincerity of these young men. They didn't really know what they were doing, and they were but they're real patriots, and they were so sincere. So this is the kind of, it becomes, it's really lionized. These people are heroized and lionized, and it becomes a huge opportunity for the army to spread all of these new kinds of ideas and justifications for basically the sort of military takeover of government, and to accede to the idea of like this military expansionism in Asia. Now, 1936 rolls around, and this was a step too far. That when, because, Tokyo was put under martial law for days, and a number of, the scale of it was too huge, and it had seemed like, okay, now this thing has gotten too out of control. It's this sort of, we've created a Frankenstein monster. So at that point, the army cleaned house. All the people were arrested. There was no public court hearing, secret court martials, and swift justice. They were executed. So that really is a turning point. But we don't go back to democracy. We don't go back to the parties. It's just now the changes that are happening begin to happen like within the structures of the state themselves, expanding the command.
And at that point, the frog has been in the boiling water, and now it's too late.
Well, not entirely, because, in 1937, one of the elections in 1937, I believe, was a hugely successful election for the socialist parties, the social mass parties. They got, and there was a way in which people were starting to, there was some, which is an expression of some opposition to, now we're at war, and we've been at war for so long, and maybe there wasn't, not everybody was on board for the invasion of China. But at that point, so I wouldn't say that it was like sort of an inevitable race towards Pearl Harbor and Hiroshima, in 1936, but things were, you can see where there's a certain momentum.
So we have a number of questions. People are fascinated by the earlier part of our conversation. So if I may, let's go back to the Taisha democracy. The role of women in all of this. And by the way, if you have the bandwidth, arts, culture, can you give us a little bit more of a context within which this turn to a dictatorship or fascism happened?
So yeah, the story about, like, for women is a really interesting one, because you have these, the feminist movement in Japan starts, much earlier, actually in the late 19th century. And, initially it's a very elite movement. It's the beginnings of women's higher education for the very elite upper classes. And within those educational institutions, it kind of fosters a new sort of feminist spirit and feminist philosophy. But by the 1920s, things are starting to open up. Women are have become prominent in labor organizations. The textile manufacturing, which is one of the main Japanese exports to Asia, and a prime, that's where a lot of the foreign exchange is earned. So it's a really important industry. And the people that is a female workforce. It's a female workforce. So even though the first labor unions are organized by men in kind of the aristocracy of labor and the heavy labor sector, women start to organize in the 1920s. So there's, and they're, militant women's unions that are, part of the sort of shock of some of the, of Taisho democracy, of, the idea of these women marching down and then, sort of punching people in the face and so on. And movements to try to improve conditions of sex workers, and to women in that work in cafes, and women artists. So there's a huge, expansion of the possibilities for women to organize. It becomes a range of sort of social positions and different kinds of spheres. I mean, there's still many limitations to that. The civil code means that in the Japanese family system, you cannot, if you're a woman, you cannot get a job without permission of your father or your older brother. You cannot marry. You cannot move outside your home. So, if you do that, then you're cut off financially. So, there's a lot of ways in which serious brakes are put on women's independence. So, even in the middle of that, the extent of women's activism in the 1920s is really interesting. So there you get, so then let's go into the 1930s and see what happens with women and the war. And women become like the fastest growing, and what ultimately the largest voluntary organization that sort of supports the war effort is the Women's Self-Defense Organization. And that starts during the Manchurian incident. And, it's in some ways you can see that, after the failure of the effort for women's suffrage, there becomes a different kind of opportunity for women to make claims for themselves in public, and that they, and so in some ways, you can kind of see the women moving into this space of war support.
They volunteered to support the war?
Yes.
Or did they volunteer to support the men who were fighting the war? Those are two different things, I guess.
Well, they would organize different kinds of groups that they were in charge of, like the send-off campaign, like marshaling, organizing parades to send off the troops or to welcome the troops. Or a big thing became in the Manchurian incident was to send off these care packages. So the the women would get together, and then they put together a care package, and it would be one for every boy in this local regiment. But they got a lot of public attention. These activities of the women were very prominently featured in the media. And so women were kind of at the front, within the home front, that women were at the front of the line. They were the ones that were lionized and were being kind of spotlighted. So the leaders of these organizations talked about it. And they said, this is a different way of grabbing some power.
So I'm not sure we have time for the arts and culture. Maybe we'll do that some other time. But let me take us to the present. John has asked about this, and I had my own questions here. So let's go to this present. There are two things here. One is, how has January 6th changed for your own kind of, in your research, has changed the way in which you look at those events in Japan? And John's question in particular is whether you might have any ideas what you can say about how, in his words, how the U.S. may come out of or how shape up in the post-COVID-19 war. So maybe you could talk a little bit about, so what does this mean, right? So what do we take away from this?
Well, I mean, I guess I'm not very good at prescriptions for the United States, but what it has made me kind of rethink, or it's just a very strong corrective to what I think now are just these comforting ideas about American democracy. And even if you don't sort of subscribe to the most extreme versions of American exceptionalism, or think of yourself as not falling into that, there is this way that we are constantly talking about, the great American experiment, and that American democracy has, been on this sort of march of progress, and the arc of history bends towards justice, and we're always working to make a more perfect union, and all of that.
And we have all the checks and balances.
And we have that too, but the democracy is not linear. It doesn't sort of go all in one line, better and better and better. And in fact, the Japanese story tells you, well, it was getting better and better and better, and then it sort of went down and became a fascist or a effective dictatorship. And then because that dictatorship didn't get better, that took Japan in this course of the war, and then it kept expanding it, and then was finally lost the war. It did such a spectacular failure in policy, then it lost its legitimacy too. And then there was a return to, we'll try democracy again. And by the way, in our new democracy, we don't want to have the officers in the military as part of the picture here. So I think that we can't take for granted that our own democracy is linear, and it's always going to be, in this particular path. It's and then, what I guess the last thing, based on what you said about the checks and balances, what went wrong, where you look back in the 30s in Japan, what broke, it's like there were problems in the design of Japanese democracy. The constitutional design had some, built-in flaws. And perhaps even though we like to, we're constantly being told that our founders created this, absolutely perfect experiment in democracy, nowhere else in the world is so amazing. But, there are design flaws in our system too that have been, just really exposed in such a shocking kind of way over the past 4 years, but, particularly on January 6th.
Well, and there are even people who think that maybe we should try something other than democracy, which is a little bit worrisome. I think that that those voices frighten me a little bit. Socialism is back, right, on the burner. There's a lot of talk about a more socialist system, which as a German, I will say, does not strike me as a particularly attractive solution. But okay, let's discuss it. Unfortunately, we won't be able to discuss this today because time is up. Thank you very much, Professor Young. And there were lots of questions. I'm sorry that I couldn't answer all of them, but we'll review them and see what else you had to comment on. Thank you, audience, for joining us today. And please allow me to thank Professor Young once again, and join us again next week when we have Professor Chung talking about the public health view on what's going on in Japan today vis-a-vis the pandemic. So I hope to see you next week. And in the meantime, stay well and stay safe. And thank you, Louise. It was a great discussion.
Thank you so much. It was wonderful.